How deep must a leader fall before her neighbors act like she doesn't exist? That question, once rhetorical, has now turned haunting, echoing across Africa's diplomatic corridors after this week's Southern African Development Community Summit. The room was filled with presidents and kings, cameras rolled, applause rose and faded. And yet, amid the rehearsed words of unity and progress, there was one absence that no one could ignore. Tanzania. President Cyril Ramaphosa, chairing the meeting from South Africa, congratulated Malawi for its peaceful elections. He expressed sorrow to the people of Madagascar for their recent unrest. He spoke of regional solidarity, of the shared dream of prosperity. But when it came to Tanzania, there was only silence. Not even a word. Not even a mention of its name. Sitting quietly on the side of the screen was Tanzania's Vice President, Emmanuel Nchimbi, his expression unreadable, his country unacknowledged. That silence became the headline. That omission became the story. For the first time in decades, Tanzania found itself erased from Africa's table of nations, not by sanctions, not by speeches, but by something far colder: diplomatic silence. Across social media, the reaction was instant and brutal. Ramaphosa congratulated everyone, one user wrote, except the dictator who slaughtered her citizens. Others asked whether SADC had quietly decided to punish President Samia Suluhu Hassan by pretending she wasn't there at all. For a continent where political loyalty often outweighs moral courage, Ramaphosa's silence sounded louder than any condemnation. It was a message written not in ink, but in absence. So what happens when a leader is no longer seen even by her peers? Is this the beginning of Tanzania's diplomatic exile or the continent's awakening? If you believe that silence can be more powerful than words, stay with us, because what happened next changed how Africa sees one of its own. It began like every other SADC summit: the ceremonial greetings, the carefully worded speeches, and the polite applause. But beneath the surface, this year's meeting carried an invisible tension. Everyone in that virtual conference knew what had happened in Tanzania. The images had already circulated: soldiers firing into crowds, journalists dragged from newsrooms, and terrified families searching for loved ones after the disputed October elections. Still, no one wanted to be the first to speak. When President Cyril Ramaphosa took the floor as chairperson, the moment many had been waiting for finally arrived. He began his address with a measured calm. Let me begin by congratulating Professor Peter Mutharika, President of the Republic of Malawi, on his recent election victory, and wish him the very best as he serves his people. Applause filled the room. Cameras captured smiling faces, nodding delegates, diplomatic handshakes. Ramaphosa then turned his attention to Madagascar, whose government had just survived a brief military uprising. We extend our condolences to the people of Madagascar following the tragic loss of life during recent unrest. Another polite wave of clapping followed, but then came a long pause, one that was not in the script. The South African president continued speaking broadly about peace, stability, and prosperity in the region. Yet one name, one nation was missing: Tanzania. No congratulations for President Samia Suluhu Hassan's 98% electoral victory. No acknowledgement of the thousands reported dead in the aftermath. Nothing. For nearly 12 minutes, Ramaphosa spoke of SADC's shared destiny, solidarity, and institutional strength, but skipped over the one country whose crisis had shaken the region. It was as if Tanzania had been airbrushed out of the meeting, an act of quiet isolation more striking than open condemnation. Sitting among the participants was Vice President Emmanuel Nchimbi, representing Tanzania in place of Suluhu herself. Cameras caught him listening in silence, his hands folded, expression fixed. When the speech ended, he was the only leader in the frame who received no greeting, no mention, no applause. Outside the hall, journalists and analysts were quick to notice. Within hours, social media exploded. One post read, "I just watched Ramaphosa's opening speech. He congratulated Malawi. He mourned Madagascar. But he ignored the butcher of Dar es Salaam." That silence is historic. By the end of the day, Tanzania silenced trended across Twitter in several African countries. Commentators called it a diplomatic blackout, a moment when Africa's leaders finally drew a moral line, not by confrontation, but by exclusion. The symbolism cut deep. For years, Tanzania had been considered a pillar of stability, a model of moderation in East Africa. But now that image had shattered. Ramaphosa's silence was more than omission. It was judgment. The official record of the summit confirmed it. The minutes of the session contained no reference to Tanzania. Not one. The host acknowledged Malawi, Madagascar, and even Eswatini's king, but skipped over the country that once hosted liberation movements during Africa's anti-colonial struggles. Diplomats began whispering that it was deliberate. A senior official from Zimbabwe reportedly said, off-camera, we could not openly criticize Tanzania, but we also could not pretend everything was fine. And that was the point. Ramaphosa didn't need to condemn Tanzania. His silence did it for him. By the time the closing session began, the tension had turned almost visible. Nchimbi sat through the entire meeting, motionless, waiting for even a polite mention that never came. When the summit ended, he was among the first to log off. The screen went dark, and so symbolically did Tanzania's place in the regional spotlight. What was supposed to be a routine transfer of chairmanship had become an unspoken trial, one that delivered its verdict without a single accusation. Tanzania had been erased. When the meeting adjourned, the silence that had filled the SADC Summit began to echo far beyond its virtual walls. At first, it was confusion analysts replaying Ramaphosa's speech, journalists double-checking transcripts, wondering if they'd missed a line. But no, Tanzania's name was nowhere to be found. Not in the greetings, not in the acknowledgements, not even in the closing notes. And then came the storm. Within hours, social media erupted. On X, formerly Twitter, thousands of posts dissected the meaning behind Ramaphosa's deliberate omission. One journalist from Johannesburg wrote, "Africa just witnessed something unprecedented. A regional leader condemned another not with words, but with silence." Another Tanzanian activist tweeted, "They didn't need to suspend us. They just erased us." By midnight, the hashtag #NaiAF Tanzania silenced had become the top trending topic across southern Africa. Political commentators described it as a diplomatic earthquake, while human rights groups called it the first moral stand by SADC in years. But the reaction was not just digital. Newsrooms from Nairobi to Windhoek picked up the story, debating what the silence meant. Was it a quiet protest against President Samia Suluhu's alleged post-election massacre, or simply a cautious move to avoid confrontation? Whatever the motive, the effect was unmistakable. Tanzania stood alone. Inside the Tanzanian delegation, panic was brewing. Vice President Emmanuel Nchimbi, who had represented the country at the summit, found himself in an impossible position. According to sources close to the team, he had expected at least a formal note of acknowledgement, a token gesture of inclusion. Instead, he sat through 2 hours of speeches where his nation was treated as invisible. "He was humiliated," said one insider. "They didn't have to say anything. The message was clear. You don't belong here." As the backlash intensified, SADC officials scrambled to control the narrative. The communications department issued a revised statement late the following evening. For the first time, Tanzania's name appeared tucked discreetly between lines about Madagascar. The summit extends its sincere condolences to the families who lost loved ones during the protests that occurred in the Republic of Madagascar in September and more recently in the United Republic of Tanzania. But the damage was already done. The phrase sounded like an afterthought, an awkward attempt to fix optics rather than express compassion. Online critics mocked the belated inclusion as the most reluctant condolence in African diplomacy. The Tanzanian government quickly moved to contain the fallout. State-controlled media downplayed the incident, airing edited clips of the summit that focused on Nchimbi's attendance rather than Ramaphosa's omissions. Newspapers carried headlines like "Tanzania remains strong partner in SADC," while government spokespeople claimed the oversight was a mere technical error. Yet abroad, few believed that narrative. Independent media outlets like the Daily Maverick and Mail and Guardian published front-page analyses calling the silence a diplomatic message in disguise. Even Al Jazeera ran a headline that read, "Tanzania's ghost at SADC Summit, what Ramaphosa's silence reveals." The symbolism became impossible to ignore. Tanzania, once hailed as a founding pillar of African unity under Julius Nyerere, now found itself shunned by the very community it helped build. Meanwhile, at home, ordinary Tanzanians watched with disbelief. Many remembered their parents' generation speaking proudly of Tanzania's moral leadership in southern Africa, how it hosted liberation movements from Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and South Africa itself. Now, the same nation was being treated as a pariah for betraying the democratic ideals it once championed. A retired teacher in Arusha told a local reporter, "Our country was once a light for others. Now that light is being switched off, one summit at a time." By the end of the week, Tanzania's silence and Ramaphosa's had merged into a single haunting narrative, A continent learning to hold its own, accountable not through words, but through withdrawal. The summit that began with polite formalities had transformed into a symbolic trial, and the verdict was delivered not in speeches, but in absence. When the SADC Summit ended, Tanzania returned home not with applause, but with silence, a silence that cut deeper than any sanction. The ripple of that quiet humiliation was immediate. Within days, funding meetings were postponed, cross-border projects were frozen, and ambassadors who once visited Dar es Salaam now quietly adjusted their schedules. It was as if the nation had been gently pushed outside the circle of trust. Inside Tanzania, the message was unmistakable. The government turned inward, tightening, retreating, shielding itself from both criticism and shame. Police checkpoints appeared on highways leading into Arusha and Mwanza. Local journalists reported that their press credentials had been temporarily suspended. Entire news segments about the SADC meeting vanished from television broadcasts overnight, replaced by cheerful economic updates and patriotic songs. The silence abroad had found its echo at home. For ordinary Tanzanians, that echo was suffocating. Markets in Dar es Salaam opened later and closed earlier. Street vendors whispered rumors of new curfews, of plainclothes officers watching who spoke too loudly. In coastal towns, fishermen said fuel prices mysteriously doubled for security reasons. The government insisted life was normal, yet everyone could feel something had cracked a trust between ruler and ruled that may never mend. University students, once the beating heart of Tanzania's civic pride, now spoke in code. One of them, a 22-year-old named Asha, posted on X, "They erased us from the summit. Now they erase us from the news. What comes next?" Her post disappeared within hours. So did her account. The country's youth, the generation born after independence's euphoria faded, began to feel like ghosts in their own nation. Even pro-government unions quietly asked why foreign scholarships and exchange programs had been halted. A teacher in Morogoro told his class, "When your flag is missing from the map of Africa, you must ask what you've done to your own people." His students stayed silent. Meanwhile, regional partners distanced themselves. The East African Power Corridor project, once hailed as a symbol of shared prosperity, was suddenly under review. South African investors withdrew from a $2.1 billion solar initiative, citing political unpredictability. For the first time in decades, Tanzania's reputation as a calm, dependable state collapsed, replaced by images of barbed wire armed patrols and checkpoints lit by floodlights through the night. President Samia Suluhu Hassan did not speak publicly about SADC. Her silence became its own statement, proud, wounded, and defiant all at once. But in the absence of words, suspicion grew. Was she rebuilding control or merely hiding from the truth? Was she preserving order or protecting herself from accountability? Across the border, commentators in Kenya and Zambia called it the quiet punishment. It was a lesson whispered from one government to another: when you silence your citizens, the region will one day silence you. And so Tanzania entered a new chapter, not of rebellion, not yet, but of waiting. Waiting for a word, a gesture, a sign that their leaders still saw them, that their suffering had not been edited out of Africa's story. Because even in the loudest stadium or the busiest market, a nation can die quietly, not from war, but from being forgotten. From Washington to Brussels, Tanzania's sudden disappearance from the SADC spotlight did not go unnoticed. In the corridors of the U.S. State Department, analysts quietly updated their risk assessments. For months, Tanzania had been listed as stable but sensitive. After the post-election violence and Ramaphosa's pointed silence, that line was rewritten politically brittle, under internal lockdown. In early November, the U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam issued a rare security alert. It warned American citizens to exercise increased caution, citing heavy troop deployments, ongoing roadblocks, and reports of arbitrary detentions. To Washington, this was more than a domestic issue, it was a test of credibility. The Biden administration had already framed its Africa policy around democratic partnerships, but now one of its East African allies was slipping toward authoritarian isolation. Behind closed doors, congressional staffers questioned whether continued U.S. aid, roughly $470 million annually, could still be justified. One committee member bluntly asked, "If SADC itself won't defend Tanzania's elections, why should American taxpayers in Europe?" The response was equally uneasy. The European Union announced a review of all development funds under its Global Gateway program. Brussels cited deteriorating governance and human rights conditions, diplomatic language that really meant one thing: sanctions were on the table. Meanwhile, human rights organizations mobilized. Amnesty International published a 14-page brief titled "A Nation in Silence," documenting testimonies from victims' families, missing journalists, and students arrested during protests. The report circulated widely in Western capitals, but received little coverage inside Tanzania, where state media remained loyal to the president's line, "Peace has returned." Across the African continent, reactions were divided. Kenya kept diplomatic distance, refusing to comment publicly, but quietly restricting military exchanges. Uganda, whose own government faced similar accusations, voiced support for Suluhu in defense of African sovereignty. Zambia and Malawi leaned toward Ramaphosa's stance, warning that regional unity cannot protect tyranny. The world's media painted Tanzania as a case study in soft isolation, not expelled, not sanctioned, but ignored. On Al Jazeera, one analyst said, "It's not a coup, it's not war. It's something worse: erasure. Tanzania has become invisible." For the United States, this episode resonated beyond East Africa. It underscored the delicate balance between strategic interest and moral authority. Washington had supported President Samia Suluhu after Magufuli's death, hoping she would open the country to reforms. Instead, she had returned to old habits: control, suppression, denial. Yet even within the Pentagon and CIA Africa desks, some voices urged restraint. Pushing Tanzania too hard could push it closer to Beijing or Moscow. It was a familiar dilemma: a nation's human rights weighed against global rivalries, and so the West watched, cautious, conflicted, complicit. Tanzania was no longer front-page news, but a quiet reminder of what happens when democracy becomes a performance, when elections lose meaning, and when silence itself becomes a foreign policy. Somewhere in that silence, the words of Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traore echoed faintly through the continent: "If we Africans do not protect the truth, others will bury it for us." The silence surrounding Tanzania has become louder than any speech. It is the kind of silence that history remembers: the silence before a reckoning. Once the nation was praised as a model of stability, a bridge between East Africa's competing interests. But after the bloodshed and the diplomatic freeze, Tanzania now stands as a symbol of what happens when power refuses reflection and when regional loyalty turns into quiet condemnation. In the weeks following the SADC Summit, something changed across Africa's political landscape. Leaders began to measure their words more carefully. Civil societies whispered Tanzania's name as a warning, not a neighbor. And beyond the continent, Washington, Brussels, and the African diaspora began to ask, how many more leaders must fall into silence before Africa itself loses its voice? It is a painful question, one that echoes from the dusty roads of Dar es Salaam to the halls of the African Union. Because what is happening in Tanzania is not just about one leader or one election. It is about the soul of African governance, about whether the continent can protect both sovereignty and truth at the same time. Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traore once said, "Silence is not peace. It is the beginning of submission." His words now ring prophetically. If silence could erase Tanzania from SADC, it could erase any nation tomorrow, not through invasion or sanctions, but through collective indifference. And that is where the story turns toward us: the observers, the citizens of the world, the elders who have seen this pattern before. We've watched how nations fall not from bombs, but from moral fatigue. The question is, will we watch again in silence? Perhaps this moment calls for something greater than outrage, a kind of moral memory, the courage to remember what others want forgotten. Because when nations bury their shame, ordinary people are the ones who suffocate beneath the soil. So let this not end in silence. If you believe that truth is louder than diplomacy, share this story. If you believe that Africa's future depends on leaders who face their people, not hide behind walls, subscribe and stand with those who still speak out. The silence over Tanzania may have begun in Pretoria, but its echo belongs to all of us. And as long as voices like yours refuse to fade, perhaps Africa and the world still has time to listen.